The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who is there and who will be there throughout the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Meeting for 4 days, said today, after the joint communique was signed by both sides, China and ASEAN countries, he said the page has been turned. Of course, Mr. Wang was referring to the disputes about the South China Sea. The question is, can that page really be turned?
Of course, when we see that this page has been turned, means the next page will appear. Actually, now we see the South China Sea issue into the different stage. In the past couple of months, it's basically about the sort of a legal dispute, but now it will be administration over the certain areas. The dispute on who has the right to control these areas. So I think this page has been turned. Doesn't mean that all the issue has been done. All the argument has disappeared. It only means we have the new chapter.
All right. Well, Mr. Paul, what do you think? How well can we turn this page at this moment, particularly with this joint communique we've all read today?
Well, the communique basically repeats the concerns that were expressed last year after the island building exercise took place, where they described themselves as seriously concerned about those activities. But now that China is saying the page has been turned, this is an opportunity to lower the temperatures among the parties in the disputes and to find new ways of dealing with each other on the high seas of the South China Sea. You've got fishermen, you've got energy exploring operations, how these are handled, how others react to them. These are all intense subjects for, as Mr. Ye has said, the next page in the story of the South China Sea.
Now, Mr. Paul, I also understand the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry, is also there at this foreign minister meeting of the ASEAN countries. How do you expect he's likely to express his messages in the coming days, and what is likely to be agenda from Washington this time?
Well, as you are aware, the Ms. Rice, the National Security Advisor, is also on her way to Beijing. And so I think the general message from the American administration is, now that the arbitral tribunal has issued its ruling, let's get on to management of ordinary affairs and let's lower the tensions in this part of the world.
That's right. Well, Mr. Ye, let me ask you. That is, of course, Washington has been indicating. But this time, China has also been indicating in the joint communique two things. China confirmed freedom of navigation and also freedom of overflight in the South China Sea area. Is this a different stance that China has been taking this time compared to previous times?
Actually, we can recall all the statements released by the Chinese government in the past few years. All the statements emphasize the navigation freedom and the flyover, but it's targeting on the commercial ships. This means the innocent passage. It doesn't mean all the military vessel has the right to do anything in the South Sea, and China doesn't accept such kind of the navigation freedom, but doesn't mean China opposes the whole concept of the navigation freedom. Our navigation freedom concept is only targeting on the merchant ships to ensure the sea line of the communications.
All right, Mr. Paul.
Yes.
Your comment about this.
Well, I think that the statements coming from the Chinese side are, as Mr. Ye has said, which is that there's no change. China has in a sense, granted freedom of navigation through the South China Sea for commercial vessels. The friction between the U.S. and China over this comes precisely on the question of whether military vessels can also enjoy the same freedoms. The United States and all the major maritime powers that were involved in the negotiating of the Law of the Sea Charter would never have permitted restrictions on the military ships. This is something that's come up since the agreement on the Law of the Sea was finished, and there are fundamental disagreements about it.
After going through all of these ups and downs in whether negotiation, discussion, debates, even sometimes quite rhetorical debates between China and the Philippines. How much China is willing to put aside the differences and work on the real issues?
Just like China already reaffirmed that China would like to launch the bilateral contact with the Philippines and to launch the diplomatic negotiation with the Manila. But for the Chinese stance over the South China Sea, I think after the arbitration case, it only means no change. That means no any stance change, no any action change means China won't take any compromise or China won't take any aggressive attitude towards the South China Sea dispute. This only means there's no impact from the South China Sea arbitral tribunal case towards China, and so China won't be impacted.
Okay, these all sound fascinating, but to me, it's very interesting, Mr. Paal. Have we gone back to square one? I mean, after all of these dramas, debates, even threats of any military conflicts, we came back to square one, which is, okay, this is something that we need to work on together.
Well, I think China would like this to be back to square one by asserting that the principles that China proceeds with have not been changed by the award of the tribunal. The fact is the situation has been dramatically changed. You have a binding international legal finding that some practices that China engages in will not have international legal support. So the question now is, how do you take advantage of the new Philippine government and its willingness to talk directly with China on their disputes? And how do you take advantage of the opportunity of the end of the award period to deal concretely with the most contentious issues? And those involve the Scarborough Shoal, the Second Thomas Reef, Renaijiao, and they also involve fishing and oil exploration practices and what's allowed and not allowed under the new tribunal's rulings. I hope this will be a period when all sides will reflect on how they can lower tensions, but we could be back into a much more confrontational period very quickly if practical measures are not taken to seize the new opportunities.
Right. Two things from Mr. Paal, it seems. One is Mr. Ye. China has, of course, have been saying no participation, no acceptance about whether the arbitration or the award of it, because China does not believe it is fair and it is legal. However, on the other hand, as Mr. Paal said, what about the next step? Whether there is a legal issue or not, what's the next step? Mr. Ye, what do you think?
I think for the next step is how possible China and the ASEAN country can work together to maintain.
How possible?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. For example, with the Philippines. Now the Filipino president, Mr. Duterte, came into power and delivered his speech. And he didn't mention about South China Sea specifically, but he sent his envoy.
But we also noticed that the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Philippines released a different voice in Laos. I think there is a little bit slightly differences between the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Philippines and the Presidential House. We can notice that if the special envoy of the Philippines take the final ruling of the arbitration tribunal as the negotiation ground, and to talk with China, this negotiation won't go anywhere. But if they just take the very open mind for China and the Philippines can work together to control the situation, there will be a window. So we still make the assessment on what's the purpose of the special envoy and what's the real impact to the bilateral relation, and especially what Philippines will do after this. We notice that there's a slight movement adopted by Philippine government and by their fishermen in a couple of days ago. I wonder if such kind of things happen again, there will be a kind of the decrease the whole atmosphere of the negotiation.
Okay, and then here is also the role of the United States. Mr. Paal, as China has always believed that the United States has not necessarily played a very constructive role in terms of solving disputes in the South China Sea. Of course, that's a Chinese perspective. But for Washington, you got a lot of interesting things going on at the same time. First of all, your presidential election going on, 100 days to go. And meanwhile, a lot of big issues, about, including terrorism, going on around the world, and also the ultimate nature of relations between China and the United States, how U.S. is likely to define it. All of these might have an impact about the next step for the U.S. What is your sense of the U.S. judgment at this moment?
Well, the important thing is always to look at the macroscopic relationship between China and the U.S. The South China Sea is not the beginning and the end of U.S.-China relations. And this would be a good time in talking about next steps for China to reinvigorate the now 14-year-old discussions on developing a code of conduct. If you look at the language authorizing negotiations by the ASEAN foreign ministers and China, it's language which, of course, has nothing about the arbitral award in it, but has many ideas that China seems to have agreed to quite willingly in 2002, and if implemented today would make a lot of the issues that keep the U.S. drawn in by the other parties because of our relationships with them, it would be much less necessary for the U.S. to be involved. So I think trying to find a different path to a solution or reinvigorate the path toward the Code of Conduct would be a very welcome measure at this time.
Interesting, you said many officials, both from China and ASEAN, have been, of course, observing the U.S. approach, vice versa. And meanwhile, China and ASEAN has their own path to work on, because there's a lot of things that the two sides have not worked on consistently over the past few years, if not a decade. Many officials from the ASEAN countries this time at the Foreign Ministers Meeting expressed that the South China Sea arbitration should not affect the overall relations. Rather, they say there are a lot of other issues that the two sides should work on. China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, for example, came into effect 2010. For 6 consecutive years, China has been ASEAN's biggest trade partner, and ASEAN is China's 3rd biggest trade partner. During visit to Southeast Asian countries, Chinese leaders proposed to build 21st century maritime Silk Road, the China-ASEAN Community of Common Destiny, and the 2+7 cooperation framework. These are all terminologies, but they mean that the two sides need to really work on their trade relations, and this time should not let the relations between the two sides be once again only shaped by the dispute in the South China Sea. Having said that, though, is that possible? Let me have Mr. Heydarian, Professor Heydarian, on the phone with us. Thank you, Professor, for waiting and for being with us. What do you think? Can the two sides really now switch the focus to be able to work on some real issues? Professor Heydarian.
Your relationship, you have to make sure that your entire relationship is not defined by one issue, particularly issue like sovereignty disputes, which are inherently intractable and will take years, if not decades, to resolve. So the South China Sea is clearly one of them. But I think when it comes to ASEAN-China relations, you also have to have certain red lines. And I think for certain countries in the ASEAN, like the Philippines or Vietnam, they feel that certain red lines are almost being crossed by certain countries. And I think that's where you have some tensions. But I think if you look at what the ASEAN and Philippines have been doing after the Hague verdict came out, the emphasis here is not to pressure and embarrass China. It's not to provoke China. I think the tide has not turned against or in favor of China. I think what has happened here is that everyone is calming down tensions and making sure we properly manage this. And we make sure that the Hague verdict does not contribute to an escalation of the dispute. So if you look at the communique that came out of the ASEAN-China, it essentially re-emphasized the things that were mentioned in the Sunnyland Summit earlier this year in February between ASEAN countries in America, but you didn't see an explicit endorsement of the Philippines verdict against China. And in fact, Filipino Foreign Secretary Perfecto Yasa himself at some point dropped the demand for that to be mentioned in the communique. That's why you have this kind of a least common denominator communique that came out.
Okay, Professor Heydarian, I can sometimes not hear very clearly what you said, but I try to hear very clearly. Final question for you very briefly. Do you think the former president, Laos, as a special missionary from the Philippines representing the president this time, will be able to work with the Chinese side to focus on South China Sea and issues even beyond that? Very briefly from you.
Yeah, as I told you last week, FPR or President Ramos is going to take up the job, and he just confirmed that the other day. He has the perfect trust and confidence of the president, so that gives him a lot of wiggle room to negotiate things. Of course, because of his age, it means that he cannot make a lot of visits, but I think there's enough of goodwill and enough of confidence in Ramos and on the part of China to get the relationship forward,
All right.
despite the disputes in the South China Sea.
Okay, Professor Heydarian with us. Thank you so much. And final question for both of you, gentlemen. Are we, after all of this drama, really going to likely catch this opportunity? An opportunity for common development and for win-win. Mr. Paal, very briefly from you.
Well, I certainly think the opportunity is there. It's the behavior of China so far has been quite predictable. We knew it would not be happy with the outcome and would demonstrate that. The question now is going into September after the G20 meeting. Will we allow the calm that settles down in international relations while the U.S. is preoccupied with elections and others are doing their own things? Can China and the Philippines take advantage of the offer of President Ramos as an emissary to reduce their tensions? And then in a broader context, can we see more progress toward the Code of Conduct's implementation?